Today I want to talk to you about my experience using the Lumix S1ii for 4.5 months as my A-cam. And spoiler alert, this is my favorite mirrorless camera that I've ever used. In some ways, I'd say this camera might even slightly be considered a cinema camera. I was lucky enough to get 2 of these cameras on launch in June, obviously purchased with my own money. Coming from using the Lumix S5IIs for a year and a half, I was pretty familiar with the layout and ergonomics of this camera, as is so similar to the S1ii. Once I set up the Lumix S1ii, I was ready to put it through its paces. I shot 18 weddings, a triathlon, a workshop, a spec ad, promo video for a local realtor, and a live concert. Days after receiving my S1IIs, we were off to Washington to film a wedding. My first impression of the camera was an overwhelming sense of familiarity coming from the S5IIs and S5IIX. But as I continued working with it, I felt more and more that this wasn't just an updated S5II. This was a totally different camera. When you look past the subtle differences between the ergonomic size, shape, and weight of the S1II compared to the S5II or the S5IIX, you really start to notice the difference between these two cameras when you take them out on a shoot and when you grade them in post. The first thing I noticed in getting this camera is obviously the flip tilt screen. Having the ability to look straight into the screen at any height with the gimbal was very useful. Also, having the ability to rig out the camera using an HDMI without it getting in the way of the screen made shooting workflow so much easier. Then I started noticing how much more usable the LCD was. I don't know what it is, but the LCD screen on the S1II is so much more inspiring and clear than the S5II or the S5IIX. I've tried different assist LUTs to make it look a little bit more saturated or contrasty, but no matter what I did, it always looked washed out and it never really felt like it was very accurate to what I got when I took it in post. So when you're not using an external monitor on the S5II or S5IIX, sometimes judging white balance is a little tricky on the LCD. And a lot of times I'll end up using the viewfinder to get a more accurate read of what the color temperature is in the room that I'm shooting. Luckily with Lumix, there's a ton of tools to help engage exposure and focus. So you kind of just have to trust the process, and when you take it in post is where you really see how these cameras shine. Luckily on the S1II, having a higher quality LCD screen is definitely a welcome upgrade. Another upgrade was having more custom modes. I didn't realize how important this was until I got more into anamorphic shooting. And having things like Opengate, slow-mo, that being a mode, having another mode for Opengate in 24 frames a second, having a slow shutter mode for creative shots, having a 24 frames a second mode, a 60 frames a second mode, 120 frames a second mode. It's just easy to switch in between really quickly. The real magic of this camera and why I fell in love with this camera this year is when you take a look at what's under the hood. This camera has faster readout speeds. Now, traditionally in the past, I've been kind of a snob against slow readout speeds, saying that it doesn't matter. I don't usually whip left to right with my footage very often, but now that I've grown into the world of anamorphics more and more, and as anamorphic prices start to come down in anamorphic lenses like the Mantis or the Blazar Remus, I've been using anamorphic lenses more and more for projects. And because shooting anamorphics, you're using the whole sensor, you really notice more wavy lines when you move the camera. And most of the time I'm shooting anamorphics handheld. And readout speeds was something that I couldn't anticipate that I would grow into. But this is a testament to Lumix and their products. They always seem to add future proofing settings and features so that later, as you grow as a filmmaker, you could literally take one of their cameras and use it for the next 5 years. And as you follow me on my journey through filmmaking on YouTube, you'll notice things change and I try different things and new products come out and my filmmaking grows. So it's nice to have a camera that has features that I'll be using for years to come. The color fidelity out of the S1II is incredible. I really like the color fidelity of this camera. I noticed right away putting it in post up against my S5II that the color grading process was easier. Even just dropping a simple conversion LUT, a Rec 709, right away I noticed I really like the colors, a little bit more saturation to it, not with a look of just adding saturation. It just had a little bit more of a pleasant look to it with a little bit more color fidelity. I can't really explain it, but it has a little bit more life to it than the S5II. Can you grade the S5II to get close to the S1II? Absolutely. But there's just something to the image. I really like the new sensor and I really like the new color science. Over the last couple months, the more and more I shoot on the S1II, the more and more I end up preferring that image over the S5II. It has like a slightly less digital look to it over the S5 II or the S5 IIX, and dare I say it looks more cinematic. I just really enjoy grading the footage and being able to push and pull the colors a little bit more than the S5 II. The low light in this camera is fantastic. I absolutely love the low light in this camera. If you've been following this channel at all, you would know that the main reason that I bought the S1R2 or the S1 II is for low light. As I grow my filmmaking career, we get more and more paid gigs where lighting seems to be an issue. A lot of events where they don't want us to set up lighting and they want us to capture the vibe of the room either through candlelight or lower lit scenes. Obviously, if you work on a set, if you're doing a lot of narrative work and you're putting up lights, this doesn't apply to you. If you're someone that's shooting in controlled environments or an office, shooting products, once again, this doesn't apply to you. The second base ISO of this camera is 5,000, and I have no problem taking it to 6,400, 10,000, even 12,800. And usually at those higher ISO values above 5,000, I usually don't use any denoising. And once in a while, if I do, the image is gorgeous. And if I have to push it above the native ISO of 5,000, I usually don't use any denoising, and if I do, it's very little. And it holds color really well at the higher ISOs. I use the Sony FX3 and the Sony a7S III here and there for shoots, and when I take it in post-production, one of my complaints with Sony and their high ISO values that usually at 12,800, I notice there are times, not every single time, the skin will look desaturated or gray, and it's hard to bring life back into that skin tone. And usually I'm filming people. And so that was always one of my gripes about the ISO values. Not having a mid ISO value and just going straight all the way to 12,800 on the Sonys to get your dual native ISO working was always very annoying to me, as I don't use 12,800 that much. I'm usually sticking between 5,000 and 6,400 when it comes to a lower lit scene. So having the ability to not have to jump up to 12,800, put on an ND filter when it's dark is so much more usable to me. And when I shoot with my Sony friends, they always complain about the ISO being too high and wishing they had either a third middle base ISO or a lower 6,400 or 5,000 base ISO to work with. And that seems to be a more usable ISO. So in 95% of the situations in low light, 5,000 is usually around where I'm staying, and I rarely have to bump it up above that, but it's nice to know that I can. It's also nice to know that this camera can compete with the likes of Sony when it comes to low light. Would I say Sony's better than the Lumix S1ii in low light? Yes and no. I've done some tests that kind of are inconclusive. There's also a lot of ISO ranges before 12,800 that are very unusable to me personally in Sony and take a lot of denoising. But because of the lack of color saturation at the higher ISOs, there's like clear, strong denoising going on in the Sonys. I personally rather use the S1 II over the Sony a7S III or FX3 in low light. Improved Ibis. Already Lumix has class-leading Ibis, so it was kind of crazy to me that they improved it. But knowing Lumix, they seem to improve the Ibis every few years in their new camera models. Already I love the Ibis in the S5 II and the S5 IIX, but just like when I've used the S5 or the S1H and then went to the S5 II, I didn't really notice the increased Ibis technology until I started using the newer camera. So when I used the S1 II, immediately I noticed the Ibis was better, it was smoother, and I was more comfortable using it for handheld. Also, the Ibis in the anamorphic modes is better as well. And when I've shot anamorphics on my S1H and then compared it to shooting on the S1 II or the S1R2, I immediately noticed how much cleaner the Ibis was in the newer cameras. The autofocus is significantly better over the S5 II and the S5 IIX, and this is both in the S1R2 and the S1 II. And most of what I'm talking about today applies to the S1R2 as well, as they're very similar cameras. When it comes to basic overall autofocus, the autofocus is a lot more sticky and intuitive on the S1 II. So when I got the S1R2 on release a few months before the S1 II, I immediately noticed that the autofocus was way better than the S5 II or the S5 IIX. It was much more sticky, it was much more intuitive, and I felt way more confident in it. I never really had too much of an issue with the S5 IIs, but it was nice that the autofocus was upgraded. I started playing around with the different autofocus modes, and I noticed the tap to track on the faces were really sticky, when before it was kind of garbage. And when using it with other filmmakers, with Sony, and even projects of my own using Sony, I preferred the S1 II and the S1R2's autofocus over the FX3 or the a7S III. So I think some of this is preference. I also think because these are newer cameras than the a7S III or the FX3, the autofocus, of course, is going to be improved. The one place that Sony has kind of a grip hold over Lumix in the autofocus is the object tracking. So when you tap to track on a face, it works pretty well. and I really enjoy using it for a lot of shoots. When you tap on an object, it seems to not be as consistent with holding onto that object. It's better at holding on to faces for sure. Higher dynamic range. The camera has a dynamic range boost mode, or whatever it's called, and it gives you an extra stop of dynamic range in the highlights. It's a pretty cool ability. It's a little niche because you can only shoot it in 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second. And it lowers the readout speeds so you get a little bit more wobble if you're whipping the camera back and forth. And it's cool to have on a shot where you need the camera on sticks and there's very little movement, and maybe it's a high dynamic range scene where you want it to look really nice. Opengate 60 frames a second. Whew. I've been waiting for this one for a minute, at least a year and a half. The dream of having Opengate in 60 frames a second is incredible. The fact that most cameras that are mirrorless don't have Opengate right now, especially for this price, is pretty crazy, as I use it quite a bit. Opengate is another example where you can really grow with the Lumix camera brand. They like to put in features in it that you might not use today, but you might use in the future and be really thankful your camera has it. Not only is Opengate good so that you can give multiple deliverables between vertical and horizontal with a little bit more room in the vertical, which makes delivering different aspect ratios to clients way easier instead of having to reshoot things twice or turn your camera vertically and reshoot that scene or change lenses. But being able to shoot anamorphic lenses with 2x squeeze, 1.6, 1.5, those are all things that make Opengate really exciting to use as you grow as a filmmaker. One thing that I always wanted was Opengate at 60 frames a second. Now, I don't do a ton of slow motion in my career, but I do it from time to time. There's times I use it for products or live events, and there might be a scene that I need to have it in Opengate, or for anamorphics to be able to do it in 60 frames a second so I can slow it down in post. And this is incredible that this camera has it. Like I said, most cameras that are mirrorless sub $4,000 or $5,000 right now don't even have Opengate, and if they do, they definitely don't have Opengate at 60 frames a second. So this was really innovative and a real surprise when this camera was released. I wasn't expecting this at all. Full frame at 60 frames a second. Speaking of 60 frames a second, the new S line of cameras from Lumix all have full frame 60 frames a second, which I dealt with for a year and a half with the S5 II and the S5 IIX, shooting them every weekend or a couple times a week, having to change lenses and adjust when I did put things in 60 frames a second. It did get annoying, and it was annoying to have to reframe shots or change my position when I could easily just hit a button, dropped it in slow-mo real quick, and then pushed it back and got back in 24 frames a second and continued on. It definitely slows down your process. And for someone that's in my position who shoots all the time and does this for a living and uses these cameras day in and day out every month, it starts to add up and get really annoying when you're constantly having to change and tweak camera lenses and positions and everything. For someone who's more of a hobbyist, I don't think this matters. And I would tell them just to go get an S9 or an S5 II, save your money, a used S1ii even. The reality of it is, for a working professional, it can get annoying, especially if you have a multi-cam setup and you're shooting all the time. So this was a very welcomed upgrade. And I think the internet spoke when Lumix finally came out with the full frame 60 camera. I mean, that was one of the things that made the A7S III get put on the map. CFexpress card. This camera has a CFexpress card. I really love CFexpress cards. And it's one CFexpress slot and the other one's an SD card slot. And what I love about CFexpress cards is they're more reliable. The CFexpress Type B cards are way more affordable now. They're still more than the SD cards, but how much time you save unloading footage. There's been plenty of times I've done a shoot and had to unload 3-4 cameras worth of footage and have it all backed up so I can sleep that night. And when shooting multiple times a week and doing this day in and day out, every little moment you can save adds up. So where it used to take me about an hour to unload, let's say 5 camera bodies, audio and all kinds of different things, now that time is cut in half or faster. And as my A cams and my B cams take on most of the work, and since I have CFexpress cards in both of them, being able to unload each cam in a matter of minutes after shooting all day is incredible. This camera has internal ProRes RAW. Most cameras in the mirrorless market don't even have a RAW format. The FX6 doesn't have any RAW formats in it. The FX3, the FX2, the FX30, the Sony A7S III, A7 IV, none of them have any kind of RAW format in it. You have to do it externally. And this has it built in. And with RAW was one of those things that I didn't even care about. I rarely use RAW. But as times have changed and as grown as a filmmaker, I'm starting to shoot more and more RAW. I picked up the Nikon ZR and have been shooting in R3D NE. Another reason I haven't been interested in the ProRes RAW is because DaVinci Resolve was a pain in the ass to use ProRes RAW. But now with DaVinci Resolve 20, you can pull in natively the ProRes RAW files and use them. So I'm much more inclined to use ProRes RAW for certain projects. This camera has false color. This camera comes with internal false color. I absolutely love false color as an exposure tool. I think it's such an easy way to judge exposure in difficult scenes. Coming off the back of using the C70, the R5C, and other cinema cameras from Canon, all of them having false color built in, it was really hard for me to transition over to the S5 II and just rely on waveform. Waveform's great, and most cameras don't have waveform, so I will say that. But having false color as a backup, just to make sure and double check your exposure, is incredible. This is another feature that belongs in a true cinema camera and yet is in a mirrorless photo video camera body. Having even waveform and shutter angle and false color, these are all things that a lot of camera brands don't have. Sony just implemented shutter angle recently into the FX3, and that camera's been around since what, 2020? And speaking of the price, the Lumix S5 II is $3,200. And that may sound steep to a average user who's going to take this thing as a vlogging camera or use it on vacations, but for a working professional, $3,200 is not much for a camera. Why do you think everyone's freaking out about the Nikon ZR? It's $2,200. There's a lot of filmmakers and professionals who are willing to spend upwards of $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 for an A cam. I mean, look at Sony users, look at Canon users. All those cameras are very expensive. One of the reasons I left both those brands. Not only does Lumix pack a ton of value in these cameras for their price point, they always punch above their weight, but they always have sales going on. And since this camera's been out, 4.5 months, it's already been on sale twice. And some of the sales are pretty good. If I didn't need this camera immediately for work, I would have waited for the sales. They're sure to go on sale again, and the secondhand market for Lumix is incredible. I picked up a ton of S5 IIs on the secondhand market for $1,300. One of my good friends just picked up an S1 II on Facebook Marketplace for $2,900. That's crazy. Yes, this camera is also a really good photo camera. It's a 24 megapixel mirrorless photo camera. It's incredible. I'm not a huge photographer. I do take photos once in a while for fun, on vacation, or if I'm on a set and I want a nicer photo or a thumbnail for a project. The fact that it can do photo and video when you need it with an easy twist of a button. So there's no camera that's perfect. So I want to go through the cons of this camera. Cons meaning things I wish this camera had. So one thing about this camera that I wish it had was an optical low pass filter. The optical low pass filter is something that I miss from using the Lumix S1ii, the Blackmagic 6K, or the Red Komodo. Not only does it get rid of Mori, or whatever it's called, it also makes skin tones and the image overall look a little bit more pleasant and less digital. So I was really sad to hear that this camera didn't have an optical low pass filter. For months and months, there was rumors online going around that they were gonna make a clip-in filter, and finally they did. I actually pre-ordered 2 from Kolari Visions, and there's a link below if you want to purchase an optical low pass filter that clips into your Lumix camera. So you can clip them into your camera behind the lens, and anytime you want to take them out, you can. It's magnetic. And anytime you want to put them in, you can leave them in there. Right now, they're going on pre-sale, and they should be available in the next month or so. I ordered 2 of them, and I'm pretty excited about it. You can also use these on the S5 II, the S5 IIX, the S9, and the S1R2. So even though that this is a con for me, there's also a caveat to this, and that would bring it closer to being the perfect camera for me. And within a month or so here, I'll be doing reviews on the OLPFs that come in the mail. Lack of dedicated timecode port. I really wish this camera had a dedicated timecode port that you could just plug devices into and jam sync timecode. I know that there is available for an extra cost another device that can do a Bluetooth timecode setup, and that's pretty cool and innovative. But I really wish it was closer to like the S1ii where you could just plug in timecode into it. Or the Canon R5C or the C70. 32-bit float internal audio. This is something that didn't bother me as much till recently. As you probably know, the Nikon ZR, one of its big selling points is that it has internal 32-bit float audio. And I didn't know how realistic this was for a camera, and I didn't know when cameras would start adding this internally. Yes, Lumix does have an attachment where you can get 32-bit float audio, but I like to keep things smaller, run and gun, and now that a camera sub $3,000 came out that has it, I wish this camera had it. So hopefully in the future, Lumix will put that into all its newer cameras. but it's a really cool ability just to plug in a microphone and go, or use the ambient audio on the camera to be able to have to use it in a pinch and have the flexibility of 32-bit float audio without having to have an attachment and spend more money and build out your camera more. And my last gripe with this camera is heat management. When I first got this camera, the first thing I did was take it outside, put it in the sun, and let it record at 4K 24 frames a second. And I got 8 minutes. The internet went crazy when I started posting in Facebook groups, simply trying to educate people in what its limitations were, especially over the S1R2. And of course, got a ton of hate, angry comments. And at the end of the day, when people started really using this camera, all the overheating warnings started coming out and people were blasting the internet. Now I have a few videos talking about my overheating experience with the S1R2 or the S1 II and some solutions that I came up with, which aren't great. I'll admit, having to do different things to make these cameras work is really frustrating, especially as an A-cam. But I will say, doing some of these managements, such as taking out a CFexpress card and just shooting to an SD card if it's over 75 degrees and you're going to be in the sun for long periods of time, putting a dummy battery in, using an external fan, setting your thermal settings to high, putting your fan to fast, different combinations of these things have got me to use this camera without overheating on a job, especially in the combination of taking out the CFexpress card, just using the SD card, and setting the fan to fast. That's been able to mitigate 99% of all my jobs until 2 weeks ago. I had my first overheating during a wedding in Vegas 2 weeks ago. I had been shooting my camera at 60 frames a second 4K for the first 4 to 5 hours of this wedding. We were going from getting ready into the hotel that was air conditioned to going outside where it was about 85, 86 degrees in the shade. And I didn't even think about overheating. I've had such good luck with this camera not overheating at weddings and on long takes in the sun that I ended up not doing any of the management that I'm usually doing for a hot shoot. I didn't take out the CFexpress card. I didn't change the fan to fast, and I didn't have any kind of a rig. I had it on a gimbal. I was shooting it pretty constantly. I never turned the camera body off. I didn't even think about it. And that's kind of a testament to how the overheating kind of works in this camera. And I live in Southern California, and I've shot in Utah, and I've shot all over the desert. And honestly, this was a user error on my part, but still annoying and got me back to my early days of owning the S1R2, where I was a little bit jumpy and I was a little bit worried that this thing would overheat. So the reliability came back into question. Now, what I ended up doing is the camera ran all the way to right before ceremony, and the camera started to overheat and turned off. This was luckily 10, 12 minutes before the ceremony started, so I didn't miss any shots through the beginning half of the day. And I immediately dropped the CFexpress card, I dropped the battery, replaced the battery with another one, and let the camera sit for about 5 minutes. I put the camera back in 24 frames a second. The second I turned it on, I turned the fan to fast, and I ended up shooting the rest of the ceremony without an issue. There was definitely a moment where I was a little worried that it could overheat, and a part of me was thinking to trade out one of my S5 II side angles and use that as a cam. But I had faith in the camera, and luckily I had no overheating issues. The rest of the day was cooler, and we ended up going into a reception after that was air conditioned, and I didn't have any issues. This is a huge problem. The only reason that I'm willing to keep this camera is because of A, I love this camera. I love the image quality and all its features. And B, I have faith that Lumix will make a overheating update. A lot of people don't agree with me, but I think they will. Looking at what they did with the S9, looking over the years, I've never had an issue with thermal management with Lumix products. I've shot on the GH5, the GH5S, the GH6, the S5 II, the S5 IIX, the S5, the S1H, and I've never even thought about overheating or thermal management or any kind of fan settings. This definitely took me for a loop. But with what they did with the S9 firmware update and doing my own tests and figuring out that the camera body cannot go to a high enough temperature as any of the other Lumix cameras that I mentioned was something that made me feel like it was a software limitation that's causing some of these overheating issues. I'm sure it's not causing all, but it's causing some. And what made me think that I was right about this was when I started getting word of the S1ii overheating, and that's essentially an S5 II in a slightly different body with a couple tweaks to the sensor, but it's the same sensor, it's the same design overall with the tilt screen and a couple buttons changed, it shouldn't overheat. The S5 II is pretty bulletproof. I've never had it overheat. I've shot in 120 degrees. The S1H has never overheated. The S5, I've never had any issues. So that made me believe that it was a software issue, and I'm hoping that they put out a firmware before next season to fix that. And if I can get an OLPF put in this camera and they can fix the overheating with firmware, this will take this camera to another level for me. I already think this camera is my favorite mirrorless camera I've ever used. The few gripes I have, that'll take out most of them right there. Lumix is pretty good about updates, and I'm hoping they're working on it because this is a serious issue. I have a lot of friends that moved to the S1 II from Sony. I also have a lot of friends that are on the fence because of the thermal issues. Something like the FX3 or the FX2 don't overheat. The A7S III doesn't overheat, and I just played with the Nikon ZR for a couple weeks and I haven't gotten that thing to overheat and doesn't even have a fan. So please, Lumix, let's get this update out. Please figure it out. Who do I think this camera's for? I think this camera is a perfect A-cam for anyone doing live events, corporate work, light commercial shoots, real estate shoots, and weddings. Yes, there's a caveat if you do shoot in really hot climates like I do, and you shoot long takes, like let's say for a wedding or a live event, or if you're doing an interview outside and it's really, really hot, above 80 degrees, above 78 degrees, and you're in direct sun, then yes, you're gonna have to do some thermal management issues and play with your rig a little bit. Taking out the CFexpress card is a huge help, and upping the fan. Also, if you have a dummy battery or using an SSD recording, that also helps. I even got a little $60 fan that's on Amazon, and I put it in the back, and that made it pretty bulletproof in really hot situations. It's annoying. If you're in that situation, you might want to think about not moving to the S1 II or waiting for a firmware update. You have an incredible lens selection. The L-mount alliance is growing bigger and bigger. I really like L-mount lenses. I love adapting PL lenses to these cameras, and I love being able to shoot anamorphic with these cameras. Having anamorphic Ibis is incredible, as I do a lot of handheld anamorphic work. So all these reasons plus the image quality, I think this camera is great for people in those fields. If you're someone who's just a hobbyist, I don't think this camera's for you. I think it's better to get a smaller, cheaper camera like an S9, which does a lot of what this camera does. Also, if you're someone watching this and these features mean nothing to you and you're happy with your system, this video is not for you. And I'm very happy for you. My goal is not to get you to buy this camera. My goal is to tell you what I think about this camera if you're on the fence about getting it. The reality of it is any camera above $1,000 that's been made in the last 5 years is a pretty damn good camera. The technology is pretty incredible overall, and for most people, these cameras are great. So if you're not looking to upgrade, I would suggest you stick with what you got and just become a better filmmaker with the tool that you have. Please like and comment if you have any questions or you want to know anything, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Also, I picked up the Nikon ZR and been playing with that for the last couple weeks, so there's gonna be a whole bunch of that content and a whole bunch of comparison videos with that camera coming up soon. If you made it this far into the video, you're freaking beautiful, and till the next time.